tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Let's turn to energy policy here. And just one point before I get to the real topic of the discussion here that I wanted to get to is that the federal government is trying to use the carrot and stick thing, except it's a lot more stick than carrot, to force provinces to get their electricity grids to be so-called net zero. We've heard from the environment minister that the feds are considering tying a lot more tax credits to provinces overhauling their electricity system. Now, a lot of provinces are already doing this, but it's a slow process and it's a very costly process. And a lot of the activists, for example, don't like that Ontario's phase out of coal had to involve gas. Well, yeah, wind and solar are not at all doing what you think it's doing. They're not at all affordable. The activists seem to hate nuclear, despite the fact that it's one of the most clean and cost-efficient forms of energy generation. But not enough for the federal government, who thinks they need to try to extort more money out, or more action out of the provinces. And this is how they're going to do it. But then we go to the bigger picture here, which is the climate change catastrophism, as termed in a new book by Andy West with the Philosophy Foundation in London, which I learned of in a great column by Joe Oliver in the Financial Post. This is Canada's last fiscally responsible finance minister, and he joins me now. Now, you contended with a lot of the activists when you were in government and in cabinet, and the one thing that I would say is that enough was never enough. And we've seen the rhetoric really ramp up in recent years to the point where it's not just, yeah, we've got to do something about climate. It's the world is burning, we're all going to die.
There's no question. This is a catastrophe that is imminent, and we mustn't question it. And that's been building up for some time. You recall it was global warming, and then when it didn't warm, it became climate change. But there was always this intensity, almost a quasi religious fervor, or certainly an ideological fervor that was behind the rhetoric, and there were all sorts of incantations of doom, and priests and priestesses that were carrying the sacred message. And if you weren't on side, and totally on side, then of course you weren't just a skeptic, you were a denier.
Well, that term is actually quite an important one, because there are a lot of people, and I've interviewed many of them, who are believers in the fundamental idea that humans are causing global warming, that we need to change something. They're even supporters of carbon taxes. But people that don't go the full distance and the full demonization and the full anti-industrialization approach, and they're vilified. They're called deniers or lukewarmers sometimes. And I think that's interesting as well, that we've basically taken this scientific process, or what's supposed to be a scientific process, and have turned it into this us versus them, very polar political discussion.
Yeah, and you can only, the reason I wrote the article is because for some time I've been puzzled as to the fervor we were talking about, the prevalence of these beliefs, and the willingness to undergo really severe economic hardship, even though what we were doing wouldn't necessarily have any effect on the global temperature, and we know that in Canada. So I was always searching for what was the psychology behind it, and then when I read the book that you just referred to, which is a social psychological analysis of it, it really came together because it refers to culture, and culture is either religious or it's ideological. And either way, it doesn't permit any dissent. Dissidence is not allowed. I mean, we talk a lot about diversity, but diversity of opinion, certainly on that issue and a lot of others, is simply intolerable. And I think that part of the fervor and the fundamental insecurity, I guess, is that it's based on allegedly a profound belief that the science is settled, and we've all heard that repeated endlessly. So there's no reason for anybody to listen to someone who might want to present scientists who have a different view. And let me tell you, there are thousands of them that do, even though they're in the minority. So, what explains that, and I think it goes to the ideological or religious commitment, it just doesn't tolerate any dissent, and that's really unfortunate, because what we're being asked to do will, in Canada, according to our RBC economics, cost the country $2 trillion to get to net zero by 2050, and the globe, according to McKinsey, will have to fork over $275 trillion. Well, this is a staggering amount, and frankly, I don't think there's any way that the Western democracies will tolerate that. And we're starting to see the resistance in Europe, where they've just gone through an energy crisis, and the cost of energy has ballooned, and they're confronted in a lot of cases, very tragically, with a choice between eating or heating. Well, that's not tolerable, and neither is depriving the world's poorest countries of energy, which is the only way out of abject poverty.
I fear you may be slightly optimistic in one sense. And my reason for thinking that is just looking at the last 3 years and how much economic harm people were willing to withstand to deal with what was presented as an emergency. And that was COVID. And whatever we think of how governments responded to that, what we learned there is that when something is an emergency or a crisis, all of the old rule books tend to get thrown away. And I feel that the branding of climate change as an emergency will license a lot of the same economic harm. People are totally willing to bankrupt certain sectors and certain businesses to fix this problem.
Well, don't confuse me totally with an optimist on this matter. But I think you got it right when you said they're prepared to see others suffer. But the question is, how much pain will the population overall be willing to? And polls indicate that it's not very much. And what we've got in Europe is a bit of a test case, because there the emergency is real. It's intense, and it's hurting people right across the board. The poor people always are the ones who are affected most adversely, but the middle class is suffering as well, and you see it in the polls. You see the Prime Minister of the UK backing off some of his policies. He's allowing a lot more drilling going on. He's backing off some of the restrictions on what kind of heating is permitted, and whether and in Europe they've defined natural gas as a non-emitting, as a clean source of energy. Well, you can argue with that or not, but the reason they did that is the practicality that if you don't have gas to back up wind and solar, you're going to have blackouts and brownouts, or you're going to use coal, and you're going to burn wood pellets. So when it comes to that kind of a crisis, and we're not there yet, but when it does, then I think people start changing their minds. And you can see that also in some of the U.S. States like California, the so-called blue states, that is the Democratic states, which have moved more to renewables and are paying the price in terms of very high energy costs and periodic brownouts.
Well, and I think to add to that, the one thing in Canada that's been so infuriating, and this goes back to the electricity stuff I was talking about at the outset of the segment here, is that they're wanting a solution that doesn't exist. And yes, wind power and solar power exist, but the output, the cost, the efficiency, the reliability are simply not there. And it's not that they might not be in the future or some other magical energy source won't exist in the future, but they're not there now. And provinces like Ontario, like Alberta, have spent a lot of money to transition away from coal because that was deemed to be an environmental benefit. They have to rely on gas. In Ontario, you have the benefit of nuclear, but even that is derided by a lot of these same activists.
Yeah, that's right. And I've written about that because I have some background. I was the former chair of the of the independent electricity system operator, which basically runs the grid in Ontario. And the truth about renewables is that in a small amount, they can have a role. But as we know, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And so as you increase the amount, the proportion of energy that's coming from renewables, then the cost starts escalating dramatically and the reliability declines as well. You absolutely have to have natural gas as a backup, because right now there isn't a technological alternative. We're hoping that one day battery power can provide the storage, but right now it's 4 hours, and that's certainly not long enough. But since most of the time neither of the two renewables, wind and solar, are operating, you have to have something to back it up. I mean, nuclear is absolutely fundamental, but it can't gear up in minutes. It takes days to shut down, and hydroelectric power is also critical, but it isn't as flexible as natural gas is. So we can't get off that, and I think the government of Ontario realizes that. They're not being explicit, but they talk about a pragmatic approach, and that's, I think, what they're talking about. But frankly, it's complete delusion for people to think that they can get off natural gas and rely entirely on renewables. It's been tried, and it's been a catastrophe, frankly.
And to bring it back to that catastrophism and that aspect of this, the one thing that I'll point out as well is that there are a lot of slogans and platitudes in this space. Now, I mean, obviously this exists in politics in general, but when we hear net zero by 2050, we've picked an arbitrary goal, net zero, we've picked an arbitrary year, 2050, and we've said everyone has to bend over backwards to make this happen. And it's not particularly feasible, as we're seeing, which is why even if Canada were to bend over backwards and cripple its economy and do all sorts of harmful things, we're talking about a net reduction of emissions in the world that is minimal, absolutely minimal, compared to China, India, the United States. And that part is, I think, probably one of the most obvious points, but it's not really one acknowledged by governments.
Well, they don't want to talk about it, but Canada is 1.5% of global emissions. So we could go back to the Stone Age, and it wouldn't affect anything. Within a few weeks, China's increase in coal production would make up for that, and we would be running around with rocks and clubs, feeling self-righteous.
And our LED powered candles, because you can't even burn the flame. That's not allowed.
Really, this is not the way to go, and it's not. It's totally impractical, and Europe understands that. So I'm afraid it may take a real sort of emergency to get people off the idea that this is something that they have to pursue at the expense of the least advantaged people in the least advantaged countries. But maybe at some point practicality and guilt will start moving things over. And of course, another way that it could happen is with political change. Mm-hmm. Right now, it may be that it's too early to be sure, but the Liberal Party seems to be in its death throes, so that could obviously make a difference. But we're seeing this issue play out in other countries, and frankly, those who are carrying the green banner are not doing well politically in the last year or two.
No, and I think to put a fine point on this, your contrast of the Canadian experience and the European experience is an important one. And I would also say that even people that are very committed to the abstract idea of a climate emergency, when the energy crisis hits them, that's no longer an abstract emergency. That's something they have to contend with. And it's all well and good to say when everything is theoretical, oh yes, we need to go and save the seaside property in the Maldives or whatever. But when you are faced with that decision and don't have the energy you need to run your business, or you can't afford to heat your home, it's not the abstract crisis that grabs you.
Well, the other thing that's really important to understand is that the science is not settled.
No.
There was a book written by Stephen Koonin, who was an undersecretary of energy and as a scientist in the Obama administration, and the title of his book is Unsettled. So that would indicate where he's coming from. But very recently, and this was quite significant, the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the body, the UN body that so many of these catastrophists look to for support. The chairman said, let's not exaggerate this. There isn't the emergency that frankly so many people are talking about, and you're paralyzing people with fear by claiming that almost nothing can be done. We got 12 years, 2 days, and 5 hours before it's the doom is sealed. Well, first of all, they've been making these projections forever. The models run hot. They've all been wrong. So why would we believe models which are consistently wrong the next time? Just maybe they don't have it right this time either. Someone who has a perfectly wrong record is not someone that normally inspires confidence. But the latest projections are getting even more strident, I think, because of the fact that they can't really back it up. And the reason that they're running hot is because they have certain relationships built into them mathematically that aren't proving out. So, I don't think we should lose sleep about an imminent climate emergency. I'm losing sleep about what the climate alarmists are doing to the economy. And
very well said.
And what they're doing to the Western world in its real existential battle, and that is an emergency, in its real existential battle with China, which is laughing all the way to the bank.
Very well said. Joe Oliver, Canada's last fiscally responsible finance minister, hopefully not forever. Joe, thanks very much for coming on. Always good to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.